Give me 90 seconds and I'll teach you how to use an n-gram analysis, which can help you reduce your Google Ads wasted budget by 10 to 20% in an afternoon. So, really quick, what is an n-gram analysis? Well, an n-gram is just a breaking down of search queries down into individual words. And so, what that means in plain English is if someone, for example, searches remote cardiac monitoring system, that's four different words or four unigrams. Think remote cardiac monitoring system. Now, the word remote, for example, doesn't just show up in that one search. It could show up in remote patient monitoring or remote cardiac device or best remote monitoring company. So maybe 15 or 20 different search terms in your account. And the real question is across all of those searches where remote appears, how much did you spend and how many conversions did you get? That's the basis of an n-gram analysis. And so what I want to show you is just how to quickly run through some of that data. And so in the example here, I put together some example data for a cardiology monitoring system. And this is like an example of what their search data could look like in their account, right? Once you actually run the n-gram analysis, you're going to start grouping, like I said, impressions, clicks, and cost and conversions onto first your unigram or your single words. And then you could even run a bigram and then a trigram, which could be two words and then three words, right? And what this is going to show you is a pattern across single, double, triple phrased words of where a lot of your spend is being aggregated and if it's actually converting for that single term or if you're wasting spend, right? So, for example, in this analysis, we can see terms like free and job, right? So, free actually showed up in four of the search terms here on the search terms tab. It had 7,000 impressions, 520 clicks, and close to $4,200 worth of spend, but zero conversions, right? And same with this job term, right? We saw this term job show up in two terms, had 5,600 impressions, and cost about $3,400 for us to run, and we got zero conversions. So we can clearly see that there's some wasted spend here, right? And that we can add these terms as negative keywords in our overall search account or campaign. But where it can get a little bit tricky is when you look at certain terms like monitor, for example, right? Ultimately, this looks like a pretty good word for us to continue bidding on, but that's why we also do a biogram. Because when we look at monitor, we also then do a biogram or look at the second term that typically comes with the term monitor. And so, for example, this would be monitor tech. And you can see that shows up in two of your searches and has about $3,000 worth of total spend and zero conversions. So if we just looked at the unigram analysis, we would have thought that this would have been a pretty good word to keep. However, we look at the biogram, which typically shows us what the term monitor typically shows up with, in this example, tech. And so we know, hey, this is actually a term that we would want to add in as our negative keywords or to our negative keywords list as well. And so as you can see from this report, in just a few minutes, we now have a handful of negative keywords that we can add into the account that should free up close to $5,000 worth of monthly budget so that we can redirect them to terms that are actually closing deals. And so the last thing I want to talk about is how painful of a process this used to be. We literally had to write a Python script, you had to parse out data, you had to build pivot tables and then do manual flags on where you would see wasted data. But now with AI, this process can just take just a few minutes. You just go ahead and export your search terms as a CSV, drop them into any AI tool like Claude, and say run an n-gram analysis. I would typically say something like break every search term into individual words or word pairings, aggregate spend and conversions by each one, and then flag anything with over X amount of spend and zero conversions. And that X amount of spend, typically, I like to look at what the average cost per acquisition is of my account, and I like to do any term that's over 1.5x of what that average cost per acquisition is. I definitely want to flag those terms. So that's just like a little pro tip. And so, really, what used to take us hours with Claude or with AI can take you just a few minutes. You'll get a full analysis of your keywords, you'll see wasted flags, and you'll be able to easily then upload that negative keyword list back into your ad account. And so, I think this is just a really good example of how AI can be used in our typical workflow of our audits. And so, what last thing I'll leave you with is we typically run this type of analysis on a monthly basis. And so, if you've never done one before, my recommendation is take the last 90 days or so worth of data, and that's the search term report that you'll want to use. And so, if you found this helpful, let me know in the comments, and I can make a longer explainer video in the coming weeks. Thanks.